War doesn't begin by turning people evil. It begins by making evil feel necessary. War is often imagined as something distant: maps, uniforms, borders, headlines, something that belongs to history books, governments, and men with power. But the real beginning of war is more intimate than that. It begins in the private corners of the mind, in the place where fear hardens into suspicion, where suspicion turns into division, and where division slowly makes cruelty feel justified. That's the part people don't like to face. We want to believe violence belongs to monsters, to people fundamentally different from us, because if they're monsters, then we're safe. If they're inhuman, then we never have to ask what in us could be manipulated, frightened, or trained into doing harm. But psychology keeps returning to the same uncomfortable truth. Under the right conditions, ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary brutality. In this video, we're going to follow that truth carefully. We'll look at why violence rarely begins with evil, but with small shifts in identity, obedience, fear, and moral distance. We'll explore how war changes perception, how propaganda rearranges empathy, and how the human mind learns to live with what it once would have refused. Because by the end, the question won't just be how war happens, it will be what war reveals about being human. War does not start with weapons first, it starts with psychological permission. And that permission becomes easier to give when we stop imagining violent people as ordinary, not monsters. The most disturbing truth about war is not that violent people exist. It's that violence does not always require a violent personality. Most people who participate in destructive systems do not wake up feeling monstrous. They wake up feeling justified, loyal, afraid, or convinced they are doing what must be done. That's what makes war psychologically terrifying. It doesn't need everyone to be cruel. It only needs enough people to stop seeing themselves as responsible. Once violence is framed as duty, survival, or necessity, conscience begins to bend, not because it disappears, but because it gets reorganized. The mind becomes very skilled at protecting its own self-image. It would rather say, "I had no choice," than admit, "I crossed a line." This is why the study of war is never just about politics. It's about self-deception. It's about how easily the human mind can preserve innocence while participating in harm. War becomes possible when ordinary people stop thinking of violence as personal. And that shift becomes even easier when the individual dissolves into the group. The power of us. The moment people stop thinking as individuals and start thinking only as us, the moral atmosphere changes. Group identity can be beautiful. It gives people belonging, solidarity, meaning. But under pressure, it can also become dangerous, because the stronger the us, the easier it becomes to create a them. And once a group is turned into a them, something subtle begins to happen. Their pain stops feeling personal. Their faces become symbols. Their lives become statistics. This is how dehumanization works, not always through obvious hatred, but through psychological distance. The other side becomes less like a human being and more like an idea, a threat, a problem to solve. War feeds on that distance. It teaches people to protect their own circle so intensely that empathy outside the circle starts to look like weakness. And the frightening part is how natural this can feel. The mind is built for loyalty. It is not automatically built for universal compassion. The stronger the group identity, the easier it becomes to shrink empathy for those outside it. But loyalty alone is not enough to produce large-scale violence. Authority gives it direction. Obedience. Human beings are deeply shaped by authority, not just laws or leaders, but uniforms, institutions, rituals, and commands. There is something psychologically relieving about being told what is right, especially in times of chaos. Authority reduces uncertainty. It gives fear a script. It tells people who the enemy is and what must be done. That is why obedience can become more dangerous than hatred. Hatred is emotional and visible. Obedience is calm, procedural, organized. It can make terrible things feel legitimate simply because they are ordered, approved, and repeated by the system. The individual no longer feels like the author of the action, only its instrument. And once a person starts seeing themselves as an instrument, moral responsibility begins to thin out. "I was following orders" is not just an excuse, it is a psychological shelter. It protects the mind from the full weight of what it has participated in. Violence becomes easier when responsibility is handed upward and conscience is handed over. But even authority needs fuel, and that fuel is often fear. Fear as fuel. Fear is one of the fastest ways to reorganize the human mind. A frightened population becomes more suggestible, more tribal, more willing to sacrifice complexity for certainty. When people feel threatened, they stop asking, "Is this humane?" and start asking, "Will this keep us safe?" That's why propaganda works so well in times of conflict. It does not always need to lie completely. It only needs to amplify fear, simplify blame, and repeat the same emotional message until it starts to feel like reality. The enemy is dangerous. The danger is immediate. Doubt is betrayal. Compassion is naive. And in modern society, this process does not only happen through speeches and posters. It happens through feeds, clips, headlines, edits, and endless repetition. The nervous system is still ancient, but the machinery that shapes it is now instant, which means the psychology of war is no longer only about battlefields. It can be rehearsed in living rooms, comment sections, and algorithms. Fear narrows the mind until protection feels more urgent than humanity. And once fear has done its work, the next step is making violence feel normal. Moral numbing. People rarely become capable of violence all at once. It happens gradually, first through language, then through silence, then through small permissions. The mind learns to stop resisting. A joke that degrades, a slogan that divides, an image repeated until suffering loses its shock. The soul does not harden in a single moment, it hardens by increments. This is moral numbing, the slow adaptation to what once would have disturbed us. The mind protects itself by dulling its own response. What first felt unbearable becomes familiar. What felt wrong becomes routine. And what becomes routine can eventually feel necessary. That is one of the darkest truths about war. People do not only commit violence, they acclimate to it. They build ordinary lives around it. They eat, sleep, laugh, and continue while the unacceptable becomes background noise. The human mind can adapt to almost anything, including what it once would have called unthinkable. So the deepest question is not only how people do harm, but what remains of them afterward. What war reveals. After violence, something changes inside a person, even when the world calls them justified, because the psyche keeps records that public language cannot erase. Guilt, numbness, fragmentation, recurring memories, emotional deadness, these are often the aftershocks of crossing moral boundaries, whether a person admits it or not. The mind can rationalize an action in the moment. It cannot always digest it afterward. And this is where the psychology of war becomes more than a study of destruction. It becomes a warning about the fragility of the self. Human beings are not only capable of violence, we are capable of becoming strangers to ourselves. That may be the real cost of war, not only what it destroys outside us, but what it rearranges within us. So when we ask how ordinary people become capable of violence, the answer is not simple evil. It is fear without reflection, belonging without conscience, obedience without responsibility, repetition without empathy. War begins wherever the mind is trained to stop seeing the full humanity of others, and eventually its own. War reveals how fragile conscience becomes when fear, authority, and distance work together. And that leaves us with the final lesson: preventing violence begins long before violence appears. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Most people do not become violent because they are born monsters. They become capable of violence when the mind is slowly taught not to feel, not to question, and not to see. That is why the psychology of war matters even in peaceful times. Because every society is shaping its people all the time. Through fear, through identity, through language, through repetition. So be careful what makes you feel instantly certain. Be careful what teaches you to stop imagining another person's pain. And be careful of any system that asks for your loyalty in exchange for your conscience. War does not begin with weapons. It begins the moment a human being becomes easier not to feel.